Hello, my name is Jennifer Adams, and I'm going to be talking about designing frameworks for authentic equity in science, teaching, and learning. This presentation is based on research that I have been doing, and I'll explain a little bit more about this research about science teacher learning in the United States. And a lot of this is also in an article that I recently published in the ASPE journal, and I will have the citation at the end. So if you wanted to check it out further, along with other articles that came from this research. So just to begin, I'd like to talk a little bit about what is equity and why is it important. This is a word that we often see a lot when we talk about education in general, science education in particular, and other different aspects of society, such as health and well-being and environmental, healing and wellness. So let's talk a little bit about what does equity mean. The definition of equity in a dictionary is fairness or justice in the way people are treated. I like to extend this in thinking about education because we look a lot at statistics when we think about equity in education, like who is achieving, who's not achieving, how many people do you have of particular demographics that are pursuing different careers and different pathways. So I like to think about equity as no statistical or descriptive barriers or differentials in achievement along demographic characteristics such as race, gender, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, and ability, and other inequities that appear in different societies around the world. When we're speaking specifically to STEM and STEM education, we also want to think about a broad representation of people in leadership and policy in STEM education and research. And just to back up a little bit, STEM, is the acronym that I will use interchangeably with science, but meaning science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, both as disciplines and as career and practice fields. And why is equity important? If we think about creativity in science and advancing discovery, there is a lot of research that shows that diverse teams often contribute to more creativity and wide applicability in any type of STEM pursuits. So it is important to continually think about this diversity of people and perspectives and places to make science advancements more meaningful to a broader range of people. And this also refers to the types of questions that science asks, especially if we're thinking about environmental and those different types of socio-scientific issues. When we have more of a diversity of people that are at the table in decision making, leadership and planning, in experiments and deciding who gets grant funding, it's important to have diversity at the table. And the way that we do this is by advancing equity in science education so that students will have equal opportunity as they go through their science careers. And if they decide to pursue science, they're coming to the table. So authentic equity, I will describe authentic equity, which is a term that I use in that paper, is that it inspires all stakeholders, especially those who are from the most marginalized groups, to be true to who they are. So this means that they are not trying to fit a different culture or description in order to participate in STEM spaces, but they're allowed to be their true selves. Designs that foster learning environments where learners leverage their own cultural resources to engage in science learning. So whether this be cultural knowledge, whether this be their linguistic resources, if they have different abilities, whether this is like their neurological differences, but how do we do this so that learners are fostering what strengths they bring into a space, not focusing on what's lacking, but focusing on who they are and what they're bringing into a space, and designing in learning environments that allow learners to be more of who that is. Values diverse contributions as collaborative resources for the co-production of scientific knowledge. So valuing the types of knowledges that different people are bringing to a problem-solving context. And it embeds indigenous, traditional, ecological, and land-based onto epistemologies in the process. So again, these go back to thinking about the different types of values and worldviews that people bring to addressing any type of socio-scientific issue or designing some type of advancement. It's important to have all of these lenses in science teaching and learning spaces. And ultimately, that centers planetary well-being. Because while science has done a lot of good for the planet, we also see where things like plastics, for example, the overuse of fossil fuels, where it has contributed detrimentally to the planet. So authentic equity is a planet that science that centers planetary well-being. And this is both for humans, non-human organisms, for the physical environment that contributes to the overall wellness. Now, this project that I'm going to talk about is informal learning environments and teacher education for STEM. Because as I mentioned, when we think about equitable learning environments and having environments that all students can achieve equally in STEM, it's also to have teachers that are able to do this. And how do we do this is by designing teacher learning experiences that enable teachers to gain a critical awareness of who their learners are, and also leveraging resources that they come in contact with to create different types of learning environments. Because those of us that are involved in STEM education know that it is a resource and a resource heavy type of discipline, where to teach it effectively, you require a lot of physical resources, both inside and out of the classroom. So teacher education is really about how do we educate teachers, not only in the content and processes of STEM, but also how to use different resources to create really engaging STEM learning environments. So this project is an NSF funded research project that was designed to learn about teacher learning and identity. So as I will be later describing, I use an identity framework to describe how teachers learn to teach, and then ultimately how they enacted teaching in their classrooms. It was a design-based approach. It was very reiterative, it was non-linear, because I felt that it was how it mirrors ILE and teacher learning, because we often think about this trajectory from novice to an advanced person or an expert as a linear process, when it's really not a linear process. It's all types of convergences and divergences. It's learning in different places, different resources from different people. And that is how informal learning environments and how teacher learning happens. And just to back up a bit, when I talk about informal learning environments, I'm talking about those environments where people learn science outside of schools. The institutions that are considered informal learning environments are like museums, zoos, botanical gardens, parks. Maybe non-institutional places include community-based, place-based parks that are not necessarily structured for science learning, but maybe more of a wilderness or, general, like city urban park, things like this. So the research also, just going back to the research, it responded to issues of teacher quality, especially for urban schools, because there is a lot of research, and unfortunately continues, that especially in the United States, that there is issues of teacher quality, teachers who are either not fully qualified or teachers who are not qualified in a subject area. And these are often, and they often end up in classrooms in lower income, rural areas where students end up being underrepresented because they do not have equitable access to quality science education. So just thinking about teacher learning, so STEM teacher quality, this also emerged from that context, merged for the need, for research on teacher learning. And when I was doing research at the time, background research, to learn about, well, how are we defining STEM teacher quality? One really definition that really stood out for me was this one by Moyer, Packenham from 2008. They have deep content knowledge, strong pedagogical training in STEM. So understanding of how learners learn STEM, knowing how to guide scientific inquiry and motivate learners, engaging students in real world science, make science relevant to their daily lived experiences, and make explicit connections between STEM and future career options. But going back to the top point, having a nuanced understanding of how learners learn STEM. And that needs to go beyond like the learning of science content, but also to the places and spaces where people learn STEM, and then also the barriers that people have to learning STEM. And that's when we start to think about equity in STEM education, when we expand that notion of how learners learn STEM. So initially, the identity framework that I worked with was operationalizes behaviors, practices, beliefs, and pedagogical knowledge that teachers develop across places and time. And these are the 3 research questions that I initially pursued. How do teachers develop, how do these characteristics develop in ILE-based learning experiences? In what ways can these characteristics be described for ILE-educated teachers? And how do these evidences of informal learning environment learning show in the classroom? So like looking at the initial theoretical framework, teacher identity. So we look at beliefs, the way students learn content. So what teachers believe about how students learn content, what they also believe about who can and cannot learn, and the nature of science content and the best methods for teaching. So these are all about the teacher's beliefs. So, going back to that notion of who can and cannot learn, again, that's when we can when we go back to think about equity, because there are beliefs in society that exist about who can learn science and who cannot learn science. And teachers often consciously or unconsciously pick up on those beliefs and then either consciously or unconsciously enact them in the classroom. What we need to do as teacher learners is either make the unconscious conscious, and if teachers are conscious about that, examining where they get those biases and beliefs from, and how can we work towards changing them so that we are transforming learning opportunities for students. So behavior and practices that deals with what the teacher does in the classroom. So again, based on their beliefs, how is it enacted in the classroom? And then pedagogical knowledge, teaching and learning, how students learning development and different learning theories and approaches and strategies. So in other words, like what is known about how people learn, and how do teachers take that and reconcile that with their beliefs and behaviors and practices. So what I did, because this research was meant to focus on informal science learning environments and teachers who were trained to teach in informal learning environments, and I'll be describing that in a little bit. There is a book called Learning Science in informal science in places, beyond the classroom. And they developed different 6 strands for science learning, for science teaching and learning. And what I did was align those with those strands. And I'll have that reference if people want to go and see exactly what those strands are and the description of those strands. So I aligned teacher identity and ISE and ILE. It's the same thing, informal science education, informal learning environment. So the characteristic of the ILE learning experiences, and these characteristics that are over here on the left side of the diagram were based on both literature and my own experiences of being an educator in informal learning environments, because I was a manager of education programs in a museum, in a natural history museum, for a number of years. So when you have teacher learning in informal learning environments, at least the ones that I participated in designing, you have direct teaching or learning experiences with diverse learners. So in other words, teachers were able to practice teaching science with audiences that came in. So you really didn't know who was coming in. So they got to practice with diverse learners. The ILE learning experiences focused on pedagogical content knowledge, so the how to teach science, allowed for reflection on self and student learning, connection of experiences to the classroom curriculum and assessment through reflection or direct exercises, and learning from working with other people who worked in the museum and were used to teaching with the different types of objects and different experiences that were there. And what I was aiming to see in the project is how this aligned, or how this this presented in the teacher identity aspects that I operationalized, and what possible student outcomes it would lead to. While my study did not focus on student outcomes, I just operationalized them there, just in the interest of thinking about, this notion of teacher learning in STEM and what the ultimate outcomes should or could be. So the research context takes place in New York City, Brooklyn, New York, to be specific, in an urban 4-year public institution. The teacher preparation program that was designed around and focused on courses that integrated informal science education or informal learning experiences. These included classes that actually took place at the Natural History Museum or Botanic Garden or Aquarium. Extended professional development. It often occurred in the summertime in collaboration with these types of institutions. The picture that's there is one of the national parks in New York City. So we also did some courses that had units or modules that took place in the national park, where teachers as students were collecting authentic scientific data on environmental issues. So a variety of these learning experiences were incorporated into the teacher preparation program. And the teachers that were invited to be a part of this study were within their first 5 years of teaching. So really wanted to see that initial teacher development trajectory. It included interviews with about 30 teachers, about a 45-minute interviews, where we designed them to be dialogic interviews, where people who were also experienced educators had discussions with with teachers who were recruited about their learning and their practices. And then there was a longitudinal collaborative group that met like twice a month for over the course of approximately 3 years. And again, in this group, it was about talking about their teaching and learning to teach experiences, and then also how they were developing different activities in the classroom, what they were noticing, and all of those different things. Okay, so designing research for equity. So based on this project, what I thought were the key things that helped in designing this for equity. First, for me, it was having a sociocultural view of learning. So looking at how learning happens as an interaction between people and their environment. There's an individual and collective going back and forth. So in other words, learning doesn't happen in a vacuum, but it happens as people are interacting with and engaging with their environment around them. In the paper, I write more, I expand more on notions of identity, agency, and subjectivity. Those constructs became more important to me than the behaviors, beliefs, and practices and pedagogical content as I started to learn more about how teachers were learning to teach and how they were incorporating what they learned and transforming what they learned in the classroom. Participatory and dialogic methodologies are also very important because A, these allow for multiple voices to come to bear in the research, and B, they allow for that long-term development and, sense of agency, and that is the ability to enact change in the classroom amongst teachers. So some of the approaches that I use were dialogic interviews, and within these interviews, I use a concept that was coined by Rita Coley as reciprocal vulnerability. So in these interviews, as a practitioner, and I worked with a team of 3 other researchers who were all teachers at some point in the classroom, either at the K through 12 or the post-secondary level. And so this afforded them being able to have dialogues with teachers and bringing up their own experiences as teachers as a way of building trust, because even though it was like a 45-minute to an hour interview, in order to have people be forthcoming, it's important to develop a sense of trust. And through this reciprocal vulnerability, we were able to develop that sense of trust with the interviewees. The co-generative dialogues, and those are dialogues around shared experiences with the purpose of making change. I structured the long-term group around that so that we all had different things that we brought in, we shared, and we discussed. And I led these groups, so both as a former high school teacher and as someone who did professional development for teachers in museums, and as a person of color, a woman of color in the sciences, I was able to also share and engage in reciprocal vulnerability with a group of teachers that I engaged with over the long time. And also it's important, and this is coming more from Google Lincoln, the authenticity criteria, stakeholder agency and empowerment. So always giving the stakeholders, and that in this case, it was the teachers, the power to both make changes in the research, if there were certain things that they wanted to pursue and they wanted to talk about, being able to make that happen, but then also giving them a sense of empowerment and making those small changes in the classroom that are necessary towards the bigger transformations. Okay, collaborative analysis. So this became also very important in expanding the research because we engage in convergence and divergence around theoretical lens. So again, having this discussion about what is identity and what does it mean? What are these, concepts of agency and subjectivity, and how are we thinking about them in the research, and what are different theories about them that resonate with us, and how are we incorporating them or not, or do we feel like they're relevant? And this led us to thinking about more of a diffractive analysis where each of us, we were working on our own different projects and had own theories that we were grappling with, and being able to use those different theories as lenses for analysis of the data. And that was more of like the divergent part of it, but then also allowing it to contribute to this holistic understanding of how teachers learn and enact their agency in the classroom. So within my research team, some of the diffractive insights that we were able to come up with based on different theoretical lenses were the ways that anti-Blackness showed up in the classroom, and in how teachers talked about their students, how teachers talked about the types of learning experiences that they developed. Teachers' political activity. So how were they viewing the political and how were they enacting it in their own teaching? whiteness in teacher discourse. So what were the ways that that white teachers in particular were talking about their students and student learning? And then teacher agencies. What are the ways that we can describe how teachers enacted their agency in the classroom? And the teacher agency was more of my part of the diffractive analysis. So the remainder of this presentation will talk about that notion of teacher agency, how I'm describing it, how I saw it show up in the data, and the relevance and implications of that. So the emergent critical agentic bricolage, I am describing as a framework both for teacher identity, describing teacher identity, and then also for teacher learning. This is coming from the notion of bricolage, which Steinberg and Kinchelow describe as a mélange of theories and their interactions. And this allows researchers to gain new insights about how power operates in the process of incorporate groups who have been previously excluded by their race, class, gender, sexuality, or geographical place. So the importance of this bricolage approach is thinking about that critical aspect of the work and really examining how power operates and how this operates in the context of people who have been excluded by society for different reasons. And in the United States, this tends to be people of African descent or Black people, people of indigenous descent, and people of Latinx descent. So I began to think of the teachers as bricoleurs. Bricoleurs is like, as I examine like the different ways that they were talking about their teaching, the different artifacts of their teachings that they were bringing in. So when teachers encounter new places, resources, and pedagogical approaches, they both individually and collectively created new structures for science teaching and learning, and this expanded opportunities for the kids, the students that were in their classroom. So this, and when I say the individual collective, this meant that teachers would go off, maybe they would go to a workshop, maybe they would read something, they would learn about it, they would design something and do something in the classroom, bring it back to the group, and then because of what they contributed to the group, the people that were in the group and the teacher collaborative, they would do something different in their classroom based on it. So it was this ongoing sharing of research, resources, and then incorporating them into something new for the classroom. So I describe this teacher critical agentic bricolage, or I'm defining it as the ongoing augmenting and adapting of resources at hand into new science teaching and learning engagements with special attention to attenuating the challenges faced by students who have been historically marginalized from science. The new science engagements also include incorporating of cultures, including the youth's language and way of being in social spaces, into teaching and learning towards student engagement and success. Being and becoming a critical agentic bricoleur considers the socio-material entanglements that constitute STEM teaching and learning, the intersections of physical and digital resources and spaces and bodies and languages and cultures in the conceptual science classroom. So this is a diagram just to visualize this critical agentic bricoleur process. And I describe like the agency identity subjectivity, relationship here, where subjectivity is really about how teachers either see themselves and how they perceive others see them in spaces. This is especially important when we think about racialized and minoritized people and how they are viewed in different spaces by different people, especially of the dominant culture. In the case of the United States, teachers who are Black and in science are often perceived with deficit lens, like they may not know as much science as other people, they may not be able to teach as effectively as other people. So this agency and subjectivity And then the agency is how they take all of this with the whole learning to teach process and develop a sense of agency. So this subjectivity, it led to their desirings, because as people of color and seeing what they know for students of color in the classroom, this enabled them to desire different types of teaching, different types of futures for their students, and then went back to their agency and being able to create that. So this critical agentic bricoleur then becomes their teaching identity. And this is not meant to essentialize an identity and say that it's a fixed thing, but with that notion of bricoleur, it's an ongoing transformation, an ongoing learning, an ongoing taking of resources and making them into new transformative science teaching and learning experiences. So just to give you an example of some of the way I was analyzing the data and describing some of the activities of the bricoleurs, and again, not to essentialize them, but really thinking about what motivates racialized teachers to design their different types of learning environment, and what compels them. So how does this intersect with who they are and as a social being and who they are in the classroom? So bricoleur of voice and visibility, recognize where the spaces where marginalized students are made visible and where they are silenced, because she thought about her own experiences where she was very visible by her race, but she was made silenced in the way that she was spoken to, and how she was the way she was spoken to, and when she was allowed to, or when she was encouraged to contribute. So this is just an example quote. We were talking about how the students of color, they didn't raise their hands as much, and how their counterparts, the white students, they raise their hands all the time. I have to actively tease out these issues, which I don't mind. So in her classroom, she made it a point of really pointing or highlighting students of color and making sure that the other students in the class knew that the students of color knew the work just as well as they did, and in some cases even better, and also creating more collaborative learning environments that allowed students to have their voice in small group activities, and then also in larger group whole class activities. Another one, experience and exposure. I think when I expose my experience to different things, they feel smart. They feel like, and it's not necessarily because I'm Black or white, but they just know that they are smart. Like when they go into the room and now it really doesn't matter who is there, they're willing to take risks and they're willing to get up and ask questions. So this particular person, she put her students in contact with the larger science community in New York City, and did things like calling them Dr. So-and-so in those spaces, and encouraging them to get up and to ask questions, like structuring, doing activities prior to their visit where they design questions or they come up with different types of questions, and then encouraging them to ask questions. And then the students being very encouraging of each other when they ask good questions, like clapping and things like that. So that enabled them, the students, to change their identities, or to change how they were perceived, or how they felt they were perceived in these different spaces. Bricoleur of equity and imagination. This particular teacher did her student teaching both in the affluent and in the more lower income schools, and right away noticed the disparities in how the students were responding to the different science teaching and learning that she would want to design for them. She mentioned that she wanted to do cool science lessons with her students that were in the schools that had more of the racialized and marginalized students. However, she wasn't able to do them because they were not coming into the school with the skills necessary. And that is attributed to their prior experiences with science. So what she did was she designed out of school learning spaces, specifically for the Black kids in the community to learn the skills, just like, doing a science investigation, looking under a microscope, measuring, weighing, doing all of these skills so that they can do advanced science in school, in the classroom. Trust and communication. This particular bricoleur that was very important to him. So therefore he structured his class that allowed for students to have different ways of communicating with each other. He made it very important for him to communicate with every student that walked into his classroom, and also building trust as a very important characteristic in his classroom. Trust between him and his students, and trust between the students and each other. Okay, so transforming informal science learning. So when I looked at this data and I analyzed it, it showed that within the different schooling contexts, teachers enacted their agencies as teachers in different ways in relation to how they view themselves in relation to their students. So this was how these, the particular teachers that helped me to develop this critical agentic Bricoleur framework, they all happen to be, racialized teachers. So how they viewed racialized students based on the literature and based on what they were told about underrepresentation of racialized students in science, they saw this as a chance for them to do something about that in developing different types of science teaching and learning activities so that their students would learn science in ways that allow them to become engaged and to motivated to learn, and then also become less of the statistics, as one of my my participating teachers says, and actually one of those who loves and engage in science. And they imagine, like, again, these different futures and countering the prevailing deficit discourses around students of color. So as critical agentic bricoleurs, they were more aware of institutional racism, how it influences STEM teaching and learning. They resist these structures through imagination, imagining alternative futures and identities for their students, and creation, adapting, appropriating, redefine, transforming social, cognitive, and material resources to create structures and realize these new imaginations. So I just came up with a little acronym for CREATES, for thinking about these types of teachers. Compassionate educators fostering relationships, and that's relationships between other educators, between students, between themselves and students, that build empathy, which is important, advocacy and activism, and trust for equitable and just STEM futures. Okay, these are some of the references that are about the research project. So if you'd like to learn any more about the research project, please feel free to look at any of these articles and book chapters. And I would like to thank you, and feel free to contact me with any questions, or any follow-up, or anything else. Okay, thank you.